All right, I hear students are trickling down. Welcome, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to have Rozana Montiel with us this evening. Rozana is one of the leading architects practicing in Mexico and with a growing recognition around the world. A recognition and visibility that brings to focus many of the concerns of her generation, uniquely demonstrating what is possible today as we continue to expand modes of practice while discovering or rediscovering ways to think about architecture and its potential to matter in the world. That world, for Montiel, is very much anchored in Mexico, a context which has for over a decade now become a significant and fertile site for artists and architects who are together exploring and experimenting across scales and mediums, building on the country's long legacy of artistic and architectural culture, while also defining with most clarity the potential for architecture to bring together again aesthetic and experiential dimensions with social and environmental concerns. This coming together is not only producing practices that are at once artistic and engaged, but also practices that are moving architecture beyond the constructed oppositions between local and global, vernacular and contemporary, affordable and luxurious, as they search to reinvent everyday life as a way to reinvent architecture for the everyday. This convergence of concerns and practices cuts across much of Montiel's work, whether she's inserting architecture to create urban public space, or whether she's inserting architecture to enable a space of contemplation in the midst of trees. With a sense of layering and porosity, her work modulates the relationship between inside and outside through varying degrees of transparency. Her deceptively simple structural frames organize space democratically, while the porosity of the infills, at times solid brick or concrete block, at times hollowed out as cast flower motifs or perforated as metal mesh, at times full-height walls or balcony edges, serve to vary the boundaries they create, calibrate the relationships they stage, and construct new possibilities for connection and mobility across the site they occupy. In Montiel's work, walls act as vectors that connect rather than boundaries that divide. This attention to boundaries and their structuring of social relations is particularly strong in Rozana's work. Her focus on designing processes rather than objects, and her interest in place could be attributed to her training as both an architect and a planner, a combination we could certainly use more of here in the US. This, combined with her critical and theoretical formation, renders her uniquely able to scale her approach from objects and buildings to the conversations she enables through them, resulting in a refreshing continuity between architecture and the city it constructs within and around it. Just this past year, Rozana was recognized by a number of prestigious awards. She received the first place in the moving category of the Archmarathon Awards in Miami. She was mentioned as one of the 50 personalities that transformed Mexico by the Expansion editorial group, and was the Moira Gemmill Prize winner granted by the Architecture Review, as well as selected by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Jumex Contemporary Art Foundation for a residency of artistic research at the Bellagio Center in Italy. In 2016, she was nominated as one of the 3 architects for the Schelling Architecture Foundation Prize. In Germany, she also received the Architecture League's Emerging Voices Award and the silver medal in the 14th edition of the Mexican Architecture Bienniale. She's been published extensively and has been featured across a number of biennales, including most recently at the Venice Bienniale in 2016. She teaches and practices, and we're just really thrilled she's here with us tonight. So please welcome Rozana Montiel.
So good afternoon. Thank you, Amale, Juan, and everybody for inviting me to this lecture at Columbia University. So let me get. So This is Mexico City, the fourth largest megacity in the world with 21 million people. It is home to a multiplicity of cities. This is the place where I live, where I work, one of the places I designed for. Expected growth worldwide will take place in urban centers. The world will be shaped by these territories of contrasts. By the way, not Photoshop, but reality. It is mega cities like my own which are becoming the think tanks, workrooms, labs, and repair shops of the coming future. For the past 10 years, I've done all kinds of research that has crystallized into a design methodology. I've redrawn my city on different layers and scales, but most importantly, I've gone out there to listen and learn from the city itself. By observing patterns of objects along the city and keeping a register of diverse typologies. My office has focused on architectural design, artistic resignification of space, and the public domain. Exploring new schemes to represent space is an exercise in critical thinking the studio often goes through. Our interpretation of a project is inseparable from its representation. We take an interdisciplinary approach that allows us to borrow registers and tools from other professional practices. Our method has a multisensory understanding of space, so we often experiment with new kinds of materials or resignify common elements by placing the accent on different formal approaches and building systems. And we achieve this by researching the layers involved in a project. We constantly redraw because it is a way of looking closer at the real, of picking up details that are crucial in transforming reality. This is what I consider my main task and contribution on architecture, transforming space into place. Placemaking is not a product, but a process. By approaching design as a process, we seek our content in context. We make sure the species of spaces we build provide us a sense of wholesomeness and sensibility on every scale, whether they are public, private, industrial, or domestic. There are three aspects in my design that contribute to placemaking: habitability, ecotone, cross-programming. Each of the 9 projects I'll present to you today merge in some measure all 3 aspects of placemaking, but some illustrate more clearly the specific features behind these concepts. The first one, habitability. The first aspect of placemaking is habitability. Habitability is the capacity of space to welcome and engage people at the human scale in everyday routines. It is intimately linked to the atmospheres generated by choice and use of construction materials and design proportions. Habitability in design is what makes a space thoughtful. Incinerating station. For instance, we recently designed and built the incinerating stations which houses the furnaces for solid waste combustion in Mexican national ports and airports. Our research for the prototype sought out the most functional form and construction material. So we drew all the elements that had to be inside the station, added the incinerating machine, and realized that a circular plan was the best way to do it. This enclosing spatial arrangement efficiently deployed the operator's program around the incinerating machine. Besides making tasks orderly, it radically transformed the way these facilities used to operate. Finding an adequate name for the project was integral to the conceptual design process. The term station evokes the replicability and tidiness of a space lab and the logistical movement around a trained station. And we weren't that far off the mark because some of these stations actually seem to have landed in alien or post-apocalyptic landscapes. As you can see in this is in Cabo San Lucas, and it's near a dump of all these metal pieces. We took into account corrosion, extreme temperature, security, exportability, and user comfort. The main challenge was that the client wanted ready-made parts, as in a prefabricated home, which would adapt to a wide range of climates, a jungle, a desert, an ocean. The walls and roof of the station, in fact, can be set up in a couple of days. For this, we had to create a unique type of folded concrete that is durable, malleable, and requires nearly no maintenance. Although a ready-made The prototype was flexible enough to become adjusted and improved to different conditions. The station becomes a habitable machine that in its round arrangement not only houses an agreeable workspace, but creates a meaningful relationship between the operator and his work. We have already built 10, and we're building 7 more. So now I will show you a video about the construction process. I think there's no volume. Sorry, wait. Oh, well, I think I wanted to show you the old one, but I think I'll pass it. It was almost finishing. But yeah, I think I want to pass it again. Well, I wanted to show you that nearby was the old one, that it was a very, very small thing that they couldn't use it for national security. Because they, even every time you go into the airport and they take out, if you come from any place, they have to take out fruit or whatever, they have to burn it there. So, because we don't want that the country get polluted with some kind of, I don't know, virus or whatever it can come in. So, well, we were finished. The video was almost finishing. So now the next project I will show you, it's a house, a weekend house in Tepoztlán. And habitability also seeks congruence with the identity of a place. In this private weekend home in Tepoztlán, a 2-hour drive away from Mexico City, we use local construction materials to modulate different environments throughout the house. The vernacular stones in floors and walls not only projects a sense of warmth, but also connects the house to the land's Precolumbine past and the multiple layers of our territory. This is the plan of the house. It's 3,500 square feet house. It's in a very small terrain, but it's with a compact program, but it has five rooms that you can inhabit. So it is, even if it's a small house, there's a lot of program in it. And the main challenge was to give a sense of amplitude and variation in a rather small terrain, as I said, so that each space offers something singular. The place can be experienced as a grand terrace with a luscious garden. The boundaries between open spaces and enclosures conflate in multiple fluctuations. The house subtly appeals to the user's perception. The emphasis is in hues and textures. There's extraordinary craftsmanship in the use of materials. Its variety of atmospheres is achieved with different heights, using large windows and sliding doors that not only contrast narrow and expanded areas, but also allows the coexistence of interior and exterior spaces maintaining visual depth. Every element is manufactured to the scale and specific dimensions of the house. Kitchen, bathrooms, closets, windows, railings, doors, vegetation. We design permanent furniture to the last detail and purchase some of the interior decoration. At times, you cannot really tell if you're inside or outside. Room divisions in different combinations transform space into one or the other. Despite its austere design, the home's crafted blends of elements gives an air of fulfillment. All of the interior and exterior elements interweave in a harmonious whole that sustains a state of contemplation. The clients have felt at home in such a way that they're considering moving to their weekend house to inhabit it more permanently. So habitability is not solely about sheltering our daily habits, but also nourishing meaning and a pleasant state of well-being. The next project and last project of the first theme of habitability is the highway service units. Habitability implies promoting a dignified use of space regardless of its function. But how do we achieve this with a public restroom? As you can imagine, it's particularly challenging to change the gruesome image people have of a restroom. But in truth, this is a design problem. If public restrooms are cramped, dark, damp, and smelly, it's because they aren't given their due place. So our client asked for an exportable model of highway facility units that provided low-cost, sustainable public infrastructure along the Mexico-Morelia Road. Their program comprised restroom, phone booths, and a convenience store. The main achievement of this project was transforming through design the negative perception users had of roadside services by offering safe, ventilated, pleasant resting areas integrated to the natural landscape. The use of a frontal concrete lattice gave character to the facility units and made them noticeable to the traveler. The lattice efficiently cross-ventilated the restrooms, but also organically integrated the units into the landscape. To lower costs, our design approach experimented with different uses of one material. In this case, we signified concrete to produce an attractive effect. The use of light was also crucial. During the nighttime, the illuminated lattice creates a safe, warm, and welcoming atmosphere, and during daytime, an organic, clean resting site. The greatest achievement of highway service units is that their simple and appealing design has made them sustainable and kept them in optimum conditions over time. Services users today is 10 more times the volume that was originally expected, and the people in charge of their maintenance are proud of their clients' respectful use of the units as if the restrooms were from their own house. In the very words of one of the janitors, they're the cleanest, most lovely restrooms in the area. So the second theme, ecotone. The second aspect of placemaking is envisioning public space as an ecotone of cultural production. Biologically speaking, the ecotone is a transitional territory which modulates the tension arising between two distinct environments. In urban and architectural design, I understand the ecotone as a place that harmoniously merges the public and private sphere, tempers the move from open space to enclosures, and allows respectful coexistence of built-up and natural areas. Rooftop court. These are samples of the type of social housing complexes that have been developed nationwide in Mexico for the past 15 years. The consequences have been terrible. Although 70% of what gets built in Mexico is housing, around 50 to 20% is regularly abandoned. Developments result in lifeless dormitory blocks whose social depression factors significantly in the real estate value of property. By activating public space effectively in housing blocks, we would be enabling a grassroots culture to emerge and shape community. But our greatest barrier has been convincing major stakeholders in the production of housing to invest in public space and social infrastructure. In this suburban townhouse complex near the Gulf of Mexico, the developer literally asked our client, Infonavit, to build a rooftop to protect a basketball courtyard from the sun, heat, and rain. Realizing the lack of public space, we proposed instead a portico agora that fulfilled the program of a community center, using the exact same space and little more than the original budget. The portico agora we designed created a new habitat through vegetation and expanded the user's program by weight of height and intercolumn capacity. In between the columns, we inserted a multifunctional program comprising swings, hammocks, library, computer room, restrooms, forum, and a playground. When the developer realized the positive social impact that the place had had on his social housing venture, he invited a biologist working in the natural reserve nearby to set up an herbal medical clinic with a small botanical garden where the community will be taught the benefits of local medicinal plants. The healing effect of the project was immediate. The common area became an anchor for resilience and equity, but it also became a hub for ecological awareness and biodiversity preservation. So we have worked several projects for Infonavit, that it's the Workers' National Housing Fund Institute, with very positive results for rehabilitating public spaces. This second public space we rehabilitate, we just finished. It's called Fresnillo Playground. And as it is often the case in urban settings, social interventions work on a low budget and a densely built environment. Recycling and resignifying the extant infrastructure in the topography of a site is the best way to create an ecotone. Ecotones that result from recycling are great for placemaking because the cityscape becomes the program. This housing unit of 102 buildings, located on the hot, arid plains of Zacatecas in northern Mexico, is one of the most violence-ridden municipalities of the region, or maybe of the country. The housing unit is constantly hogged by members of organized crime, protecting their territorial influence from other cartels. Besides the social scars inflicted upon the young people growing up in this unit setting, the housing complex had a visible urban scar. A former open-air sewage canal had been paved, and what remained was a dry creek dividing the unit into two halves. Although the canal was a well-flanked delimited space, it was fragmented, inaccessible to many people, and difficult to cross due to poor bridge infrastructure. We observe that children like to slide in the rain gutters, and some teens and adults play football in a small area, but generally it was an unwelcoming place with no shade at all. So as you can see in the image here, this was the bridge. So imagine to cross, you had to go down and then up. So somebody with discapacity or with strollers, whatever, you could not cross. Also, if you wanted to cross this way, so you had like a long path, you could not cross. There were no trees in all this area, and it was always empty, and it's a very dangerous place with 102 buildings with all these colors that are really aggressive. And so we work with the people and not only for the people, and we did a lot of workshops to help people voice their needs. So our main tactic was transforming this urban scar or hostile border of the landscape into an attractive horizon people will feel drawn to. We made a universally accessible bridge that opened an esplanade underneath. The crossing path is more than a bridge. It becomes a playground in itself and a place for shade where everyone gathers. It even becomes a multifunctional place. It is well illuminated at night, so it's the lantern of the site. We rebuilt the canal slopes to make them work as resting areas, as agora steps, and as part of a playground program of climbing walls where rain gutters were resignified as slides. After studying the local vegetation, we planted certain species of trees on canal flanks to cool and shade the area. And we also used lines of color to suggest activities on the ground floor. In fact, one of the most dramatic change on the cityscape was effected through mere color. We changed the original shrill, aggressive colors on the buildings to an earthen palette that made them more welcoming on the human scale and blended them better with the natural soils of the area. So we changed the whole area with only changing the color of the site. So color gave them a sense of fresh start and made them feel at home. Residents felt like they had moved to a different place, not having moved at all. When derelict, underused, or disused urban space is approached as a natural topography, an unclaimed characteristic of territory can become resignified as a place with character that renegotiates the social tensions of a given environment. Young people with community leadership, like Lalo here in the picture, became close to us. He would like to visit Paris someday. Although his dad and many other of his friends and family members have been killed by organized crime, he has great motivation and has not lost his enthusiasm for doing all these activities with the kids. Unclaimed urban spaces can be transformed into inclusive places rich in function diversity. Places of resilience where, despite the surrounding violence, young people like Lalo can teach their Zumba classes. So now this empty place has hundreds of kids playing around with very simple interventions. There's very micro acupuncture. We can make a big change. The next project, Boy Temple. Placemaking is about building processes which enable meaningful connections between species of spaces and people. But even more so, I would say it's recognizing the meaningful connections that lay the ground for any building process. The Boy Temple, which you see here on screen, is the project that best represents this touchstone idea in my work as an architect. This project, done in collaboration with Derek Delecamp, it's one of the 7 landmarks in the landscape along the route of a 200-year-old pilgrimage, which annually goes across the western highlands of Mexico. Approximately 1 million people travel by foot 117 kilometers around springtime. This wide concrete wall forming a 40-meter diameter circle is a peace place amidst pine woods that blend in with the particular topography of the site. It builds an ecotone by respecting the terrain slope and elevation at some points, suspended 3 meters high at others, buried to respect horizontality. But its essential feature is to be an open boundary, an austere tectonic gesture in the landscape that marks more than a site or territory. It is an expression of timeless space. In our research, we realized the sense of timelessness evoked by historical circles of stone. That is due to the fact that their form is not bound to any specific vital function, except perhaps their very vital one of building significant relationships. Whatever their intent, these spaces were active by the bonds and exchange which set them in place. Boy Temple is an ecotone that includes the macrocosmos in the microcosmos. As an architect, I am careful that the effect of what we design leads to connectedness and integration. When architecture takes for granted the social ground which makes it happen, it forgets its vital effect to build relationships. Relationships are the primary shelter of any society. Without them, proper shelter cannot exist. Cross-programming. The third aspect of placemaking is cross-programming. In other words, expanding the program for mixed functions and temporal uses in compact spaces. This strategy has been particularly successful when intervening public space. An expanded program engages different age groups and audiences round the clock, so it's very effective in reconstructing the social fabric that activates community. As I've been showing, community engagement is a key element in the activation and sustenance of public space. By cross-programming, placemaking promotes public space as an anchor for resilience and equity in society. Common unity. In Mexico City, as I already mentioned also, housing complexes are massive. 25% of the Mexican population lives in housing units. They are cities in their own right. Common unity is an intervention we did in the San Pablo Jalpa unit housing, which has approximately 7,000 inhabitants and is located in the north part of Mexico City. What we found was a section housing unit where zoning and access had been altered through fences and barriers built by the inhabitants over time. Public space had been invaded for private uses, was underused, or simply inexistent. One of our design strategies to reclaim privatized spaces for public use was to shift the vertical, railings, walls, gates, and closures, which separate and divide for the horizontal, roof, shelter, floor, that connects, reunites, and encourages community interaction. In Mexico, because of safety issues, both private property and public space are protected by railing, walls, fences. This phenomenon is unjustified when protection becomes a barrier. When we first got to Jalpa, everything was gated. Every single square was privatized, and of course, these bars could not be championed. The barriers mounted by owners to define their limits fragmented the landscape into passageways and corridors that push social life out of common areas. Like I said, the gates were untouchable. So we work around the barriers created by the inhabitants in order to make them permeable, democratic, and meaningful, and we transformed the space into this. The horizontal became more than just a roof. The shelter common areas we designed expanded the program of potential activities through compact multifunctional structures that cater to all age groups round the clock. The new design spoke for itself. People willingly gave up 90% of the barriers. Engaging the community through several site actions and workshops made our design appealing. Site actions are a characteristic signature of our work. They are very low-cost interventions that involve the people with their space in a ludic, innovative way. For one of these actions, we hung a white plastic tarp with the legend, "I will use this space too." Throughout the week, we provided markers to all passerbys, and they wrote on the tarp different ideas for the use of that space. That gave us an insight of their needs and got people interested in what could happen there. Trust was the touchstone for change. We developed integral low-cost improvement of public space using simple materials, which were signified to speak a new language. The roofs were complemented with multifunctional panels, blackboards, climbing walls, nets, handrails, ropes and rings, parallel and monkey bars. We also designed different pavements, some of them permeable to avoid flooding, and made them work with the existing vegetation. Rehabilitating public space restored the community use of it, transforming the unit into common unity. As of today, the healthy playground setting shows constant activity. There was an old leaky shed called El Saloncito that was already in use as a multipurpose room for school tutoring, knitting clubs, and religious instruction. Our intervention brought out all its potential. A totally different space emerged in the same place. We kept the exact same area of the old one, but used natural materials, open visuals, and light transformed it into a welcoming place. A bookstore donated an important collection of children's books, and this became a library. So we went from a gloomy shed to a sunny library reading room. Today, the resulting place is filled with life and constant community activity. Design that facilitates placemaking builds with the community, not only for it. Our designs substitute barriers for boundaries. 2 weeks ago, I spoke with Cesar, one of the residents, and he told me that thanks to the improvements in those common areas, the real estate value of the surrounding apartments had increased by double. Buyers were solely interested in the apartments of the renovated areas. So selling his apartment allowed him to fulfill a lifelong dream of buying a house in his hometown. Placemaking is understanding that the added value of architecture is a social construction that enables growth. One spare room. Cross-programming is also effective in private homes, particularly in social housing. An extra room, through the lens of cross-programming, may potentially be used as an extended family unit space for grandparents, married children, or grandchildren, a loft for rent, a warehouse, a workshop, a store. This approach densifies urban economy activity, shortens homework distances, capitalizes on the existing social fabric, offers accessible spaces for rent, and avoids urban sprawl. With all this in mind, we designed and built a low-budget prototype spare room for townhouse rooftops in a very dense environment of social housing with houses of only one room. The spare room provides more privacy to the inhabitants and thus combat overcrowding and domestic violence with a budget of $4,000. Some neighbors are also building one more floor, as you can see here in the image. Many times with no regulations and no design, so this becomes a big problem. Our prototype adds about 250 square feet to a home's living area, thanks to the exterior staircase that we have here and a loft height of the actual room. The challenge of this project was to find a way to maximize space and not simply to subtract space from the ground floor. So we used the underused side patio in these homes. there is space for 5 or more people to sleep in the house in the new area that we built. Our spare room model, what tries to do is innovate and experiment with a biopanel, that it's a bamboo, sustainable, attractive material, and with recycled insulating, non-flammable polyaluminum panels. The prototype was built under the One Spare Room program of Workers' National Housing Fund Institute, again, Infonavit. The prototype, because of its height and cross-ventilation, has an incredible microclimate as it is located in Morelos in a very hot weather. It has become a playful place for kids, and it allows bottom-up microurbanism to adapt to household needs. The type of placemaking that cross-programming allows through spare rooms in social housing units implies an accessible, viable, informal urban model for social diversity because it endorses efficient production practices that are not present in a sprawl urban arrangement, and it duplicates the land use at a low cost and promotes an accessible real estate market. So this last project, called Urban Exchanger, is this project that I would like to show you that we have implemented in the work with an international setting. Since the vision of placemaking is exportable to other economical or social political realities. From the standpoint of placemaking, cross-programming achieves efficient commercial exchange, but also facilitates information and knowledge exchange. In a collaboration funded by the Urban Exchanger program in Berlin, we team up with the SMAC Berlin studio to study solutions in tandem for 2 neighborhoods, both dormitory suburbs on the edge of their cities and both with a complex social fabric, Miravalle in Mexico City and Hellersdorf in Berlin. This double reading opens the idea that small-scale projects can produce a ripple effect in the larger scale. We learn that going back to basics and understanding a site's own resources and essential needs can really make a change in the perception people have of their own place. In the case of Miravalle, it was water. In the case of Hellersdorf, it was light. Hellersdorf is a well-planned and maintained suburb which has sadly become known in the media as a socially unstable place with permanent tension around immigrant and refugee centers due to far-right violent demonstration promoted by residents. However, we also found many local initiatives with a social purpose present in the surroundings of the Castanien Boulevard in Hellersdorf, Berlin. Newcomers told us that women rarely left their quarters in order to avoid confrontation and provocations. We asked them what they required the most, and their answer was, we need a place where we can show our cultural values and offer all the goods our culture can give. We like that newcomers brought newcomers, so our team designed a site action for a disused back-end supermarket whose closed facades cast a negative shadow on the whole area. Temporary use of the space as a fruit hall during the International Garden Exposition would promote its reactivation and be a takeoff for negotiations with the owner who refused to sell it, speculating on a rise of the building's value. Inspired by the more informal setting of the internet cafe run by the refugees, we designed an open space which allows cross-programming, activates common areas, and fosters social integration. To develop a social district, Hellersdorf needs to reconnect people to the public realm. It would benefit from informality at a certain scale to engage community. A tactic would be to prototype temporary solutions that could gradually build spaces for diversity. So Hellersdorf and Miravalle could both use a bit from each other. Miravalle, in this case, lessons of resilience their lessons come from informality. It is a self-built unplanned settlement which nonetheless has a highly organized community. But it also has a huge problem of water supply, like the rest of Mexico City. It lacks a culture of water harvesting, unlike Berlin's water management. This underused dome that was already there, we redesigned it as a water collector that became a pedagogical tool built and operated by the community that would detonate a water recycling awareness from the periphery inwards. Using a water public service installation as an instruction awareness center was a cross-programming at its best. The visible public intervention empowered and connected the people to their sense of responsibility in resource management. Despite the community's proximity to the Guadalupe volcano, they had completely turned their back to the natural world. So the side action we planned invited the local people to take a walk up the volcano hill. The hike had an enormous social impact. For the first time, they said, the community looked at their homes from the volcano perspective. The irony of this fact could not be any greater, considering Miravalle literally means in Spanish, look at the valley. So change begins with a shift of perception. To revitalize the under-dreamed spaces of a city, we work out ideas in real places in collaboration with real people. We model architecture's effect and reception. So this means going back to the basics of design. To conclude, never underestimate the power of a line to redefine space. The line can transform a barren ground into a playground, empower the disenfranchised, connect a whole community along a string of lights, give shelter, project a temple. More than following a line of design, the challenge is to make the line a presence, a vector, a force. When we activate that force, we organize, mobilize, we generate change. I've learned not to treat people as consumers of space, but as placemakers. People are the line that connect the dots. Be an insider of space. Interact, integrate, involve. Invest in placemaking. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rozana. That was a great way to start the semester. For many of the students, it's the last one before they graduate, and so it's always interesting to imagine, how they can engage. You started the lecture by emphasizing the word context and this notion that your work is really embedded within that context, which is your city, Mexico City, and all that it means. I was curious to hear why you think Mexico and Mexico City are, or have been, for the past 10, 15 years, such a hub of kind of artistic, intellectual, I mean, there's a kind of renaissance, and where you think that comes from. I was thinking about, most recently, or at least in my sort of personal, maybe because Marcus visited today, but, Rotterdam in the 90s, was a real kind of a hub, and it was the result of government support in terms of supporting young practices. It was the fact that a lot of practices started with master plans, actually, versus private homes, which is very different from, in the US you start with the private home, and so it was kind of quite different that the emerging practices were starting with the city. And there was this kind of real sense, and Konstantinos is here, and I think Athens, something is bubbling up at Athens despite everything, right, almost. And, what makes these places, unable in ways that I think we were not really experiencing here. So I was kind of curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, Well, I think that Mexico and Mexico City is a very vibrant city. It's very big, as I said, 21 million people with the conurbated area. And I think that there are many possibilities of doing things in Mexico City. So I think there are a lot of young practices. I can see here two colleagues like Gabriela and that are very young also, and they have their own practice, and they're doing incredible things in Mexico City. So we have a lot of opportunities. You have to follow those opportunities. I think that, as I show you a lot of projects that we have been doing with Infonavit, as I told you, and Carlos Cedillo is the director of this part of, which is contracting a lot of offices, and he was telling me that he has done 1,000 projects in like the last 4 years, and 30% or 40% have been built with different offices. So there's many projects going on, and
he represents government? Or?
He represents the government. He works for Infonavit. He's the director of the Center for Sustainable Research. And Infonavit is the Workers' Fund Institute, so they give workers money to buy their houses. So that's why they built, well, they used to build in the 70 houses. Now Infonavit doesn't build anymore, but they just give the money so people can buy their houses. But since 4 years ago, what Carlos has done, working in Infonavit, is that he has contracted projects to rehabilitate public space, to do once per room, to do different buildings. So he's like doing a lot of things all around Mexico. But not only that, but I think that also, like if, as I said before, that there are a lot of opportunities in Mexico if you really find them. So you, yeah.
It's also interesting though, and I think that's a kind of recurrent conversation here, you know, this kind of arc where, let's say, a generation or 2 generations ago, there was a sense of being a global architect, having a kind of global practice, and being able to fly in and fly out. And now, even when Ada and Giuseppe are here and you know, just finished an incredible, really beautiful housing project in Johannesburg, but they developed a sort of real sense of place, and you know, it's also a different culture where a lot of the more interesting practices now are emerging as a result of being quite embedded. And so this new connection that you made with Berlin, right? So it's both, it's a kind of different network. How do you, which is, I mean, quite interesting for me, and I think for here, you know, at the school, to think kind of relationally across these contexts. What are some of the similarities and differences that, I mean, you've spoke about the similarities, but I was wondering about some of the differences, or how that project is evolving in terms of this, you know, are you building a kind of network of partners in a way around the world, or?
So this exchange was really interesting. What was really interesting is that we made this booklet with a double reading of Mexico and Berlin. And at the beginning, we thought it was really different. But when we were there, as I explained you, the Hellesdorf and Miravalle were quite similar. They had a lot of similarities. Even one was like self-built and the other was totally the opposite. We found out that they were having the same problematics, the same problems. And we came with the idea that we needed to go again back to basics. And what was evident was that they needed water, they needed light, and they needed very simple things that also with these actions, you can make a bigger change. No? It was impressive how the volcano walk, like you can say it required no budget at all. It was a very simple thing. It changed the perception of the people. And now the people of Miravalle know that they have this natural resource and they don't have to give the back to the volcano. So instead, try to pull out all the resources that they can take from that natural resource they have there. So, well, those were the similarities. But I think that what was very important is that we went there and spent 10 days in Berlin doing this research, and then they came to Mexico. And I think this type of exchanges like really embeds you, or you have to go into that city or into that area and study what they're doing. No? I think that these type of exchanges are really helpful for maybe for students to go to a place, but really live in that place, no? Really understand what's underneath the surface of those places to make a project.
I wanted to pick up on this, back to basics, because on the one hand, there's a sense of, I think, again, a kind of search in terms of architecture, going back to basics to relearn what architecture can be or can do, or you're here, and I had a similar conversation, I don't know, a year ago with Kirsten Gears, who is quite different, but it was always a similar sense of like, let's go back to basics. Like, what is a window? What is a wall? What is, there's this sort of stripping back. How do we reconnect architecture with all these parts? And my question is, what about scale? If we think of someone like Koolhaas, who left us a kind of manifesto this big saying the problem to solve or to engage is the problem of scale. And we last semester, Juan organized a really interesting symposium with the 20 emerging practices, and everybody was like, whatever, I'm just going to do my little thing here on the side. And I found this little village, and it's, and you're like, okay, what about scale? Is that still important, or is it not? Or are we, because maybe it's not, maybe it's about saving the one life. It's a kind of different, or maybe in the age of information, the small scale can produce big change, as was, Andres Lepic's project at MoMA. So, what is for you, as someone who connects the dots, right? You have these aerial views and these kind of, and this sense of always connecting the brick to the larger territory. It's so clear in your work. How does scale come in? Or is that still a problematic for us architects? Or was it not the right problem?
Well, I think scale, yes, it matters. But I think that we have taken scale in many times in a wrong way, just from a top-down view. And when we take the scale from this top-down and we forget about the bottom-up, then it becomes a problem. I think that, and also on the other side, if you only take the bottom-up and go to the top-down, it also becomes a problem. So I think we have to be in the middle, in the in-between, that I think sometimes is very difficult to understand that to generate scale and to work with these top-down institutions and to go bigger, you have to understand the bottom-up and the small scale and interweave them all the time and understand. So if you just go from the top-down, because what happens in Mexico, in many municipalities, is that these architects that work for the government are just drawing these master plans, and they haven't been in the place. They don't even know the space, the place, they don't connect with the context, and they just draw from their desk. So that's a problem. And then you see the master plans, and then you say that's impossible to be built. So it just goes again to the other director of the municipality, and it stays there. And also from the other side, if you just go and work with the community and people, sometimes they don't pay attention to design because they're surviving. They say, well, design is not important. And then that it's not good also, but then you have to be, again, in between and understand that you have to work with the people, you have to work with the institutions, but the institutions people have to understand the larger scale, they have to go to the place and learn more, and the other people have to understand that design matters. So I think it's a very thin line to do it.
It's so interesting because, for me, this is where the kind of planner thinking is so important, right? Because you're embedded within a context where scale is not literally scale, as in physical, but the scale of the network and the institutions and the forces that you need to engage in weaving these scales together seems to be such an integral part of the practice. It's no longer a kind of, formal manifesto. It's a different kind of operation in between scale. And you mentioned this question of representation. And as you were speaking, I was, thinking about your videos, that you like moving up and moving down, and a lot of the videos had people dancing in them. And so, where does the video come in? Is it part of your process to register these shifts in scale, or is it, you didn't talk so much about your kind of process in terms of redrawing, as you said, and I was wondering about, it is something that we talk a lot about here, actually, kind of inviting students to think about film again and storytelling, as a way to not just, gather data, but rather gather this. So where does that come in for you?
So. As you saw the first video of the Post-its, like it has been really interesting to redraw with Post-its. It was just, we were in the office and we found the Post-its and we start drawing on the Post-its. And then it became like we had like 100 Post-its. And then we said, oh, well, so we have been doing all these observations and doing in Post-its. So then we decided that pink was the color to do it. And we start drawing all these Post-its. So we have more than 300 Post-its. And what we do is that when we go to any place or for a project, we start drawing these ideas, very simple ideas. Sometimes they're observations, but sometimes they become part of the ideas of the project. So the Post-its are like, they're mixed up, like with observations, with just things that we see, and ideas for the project. And we're doing a book now that it's called UH. It's Unidad Habitacional, Social Unit, Housing Unit. And it's about all these Post-its and about all these ideas of the 3 projects that I showed you of rehabilitating public space. It has been really fun to do it because we have been like, in Mexico you say contexto, and context with text. And so we are producing this book with all these ideas of text, but all these ideas of drawings and the places. So it's really fun. We try at the office to every project represented in a different way. So I think that video is very helpful because you can understand it from another point of view. How can I show you that they were sliding? How can I show you how they dance if it's not with a video? No? So I think it's very important.
And what about the kind of architectural language? On the one hand, you can explain it in terms of using local techniques, etc. But there is something beyond that, I think. Again, this kind of return to basics, and I see it in some of the work. There's Tatiana and Frida, and like the kind of almost primitive. There's a sort of monolithic, aspect to the work. I mean, yours is a little bit more screen-like. But what is your How do you situate yourself? Are you looking at the kind of cultural sort of the history in Mexico, or is it a kind of wider sensibility? Where does this come in for you? Or is it just, this is what is there, this is what we're going to use, and
Well, we try to search content in context, as I said before, but also I'm very interested in materiality, in resignifying materials. For example, the common unity, as we had a very low budget, we had this concrete floor that it's very common in Mexico, that you use it all the time and it's very cheap. But what we did is that we turn it one way to the other. So instead of putting them together, we turned them, and so it created a space in between for grass to grow. So using very simple, I like to use very simple elements and to re-signify them so they can be transformed in another thing. I think that's very important. And I also like to be very clear with materiality, not many materials, but the material that you need to use. For example, the incinerating stations. We did a lot of molds for doing this concrete, this folded concrete, because the client said, I need to make a concrete that nobody can repeat it, because I don't want anybody to copy or anybody to get the job. No? If you know how to do it, then they can give the job to somebody else. So please design this concrete that nobody else can do. So we did a lot of molds to do it, and it has been really
great.
But it's amazing. No, it's been amazing, the process, how we've done it, to experiment with this material. Yes. So
can you imagine working outside of Mexico, or?
Yes, we designed a house in Miami. Mm-hmm. It has not been built, but
Miami.
Yeah, outside of Mexico.
No, but I'm thinking, I don't know, in Lebanon we have such a terrible garbage problem. You should bring your incinerators there, or I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I would love to now. Now we'll be teaching a studio at Cornell University with Derek Camp also, so that will be really interesting. And we're talking about the border also, ideas of the border from Mexico and United States. So to rethink the border.
Well, hopefully you'll get work here, although I don't know if it's a good time, but we'd love to see more of you. Should open it up for questions.
Thank you. My question is, you mentioned the territory more than once, the territory of the architecture, and you seems to open the territory to the public with total openness. Physically openness too. In your project, you rooted in Mexico with a climate really warm, with physical envelope not so necessary. My question is, do you consider the physical envelope if, for example, your projects be in the north, where weather is cold, you have to put physical separation with the environment. Will this territory of the architecture change, or could you respond to this?
But are you talking about specific project or in general?
In general.
Well, yes, I think that you have to respond to each climate, each weather, each condition that you are given. No? I think that you respond to it as, we in Mexico, from the parts that we have, in Mexico City, there's not an extreme weather change. So it's very stable, Mexico City. But in other parts of the country, yes, you have to respond to the context and to the conditions, to the weather conditions. I don't know if I'm responding to your question, or.
The territory, the openness in your architecture, will it be? I didn't see an emphasis on the envelope of your architecture.
Oh, okay,
do you think envelope and territory has a relationship?
For example, in Zacatecas, the Fresnillo playground, we were given a very low budget, and we were given the canal slope. No? So we had to use what we had in the context to create the playground. And we just, it's open, it doesn't have any, because we didn't have money to build something, and we just use what we had. So that's why, when I refer to use content in context, that's what I'm meaning. And for example, in Mexico City, Common Unity, that it's only the roof, it's also a very stable weather, and it's open as for the low budget, and they just ask for a roof also. So yeah, I think that in these cases, the weather conditions with the cross-ventilated things that we do and with, with the materials that we use, I think that's good to do it like that.
Excuse me, I think what the gentleman's question was trying to get at is, with the ecotone, you kind of have this openness of the boundaries between one area and another area, and that's very vibrant. In a northern climate where you have to deal with heat and cold and separating those two areas with a physical boundary, which isn't as open or you know, if you have to have a glass boundary, how might that be reinterpreted to still allow for the ecotones when you have a hard boundary for environmental purposes? Is that kind of what you were getting at, or?
Yeah.
We gotta get her a job somewhere in Canada.
Right, so
Well,
maybe it's
we'll
an
think
unfair
about
question
it.
at this point, but you know, I
Yes.
think it's very convenient in Mexico City that the environment, the climate is very uniform, but in the Northeast, as an example, we don't have that luxury.
Well,
Sorry, I would like to help here, Rozana, because I also work in Mexico City and I know what you're asking. But I guess this goes back to Amal's question, or at the beginning, what are the possibilities, or why are so many things happening in Mexico? And it's probably because of this also. Like the condition and the weather permits like architecture with low budget and low materials to like simply make a gesture on the landscape and change an environment. And I would say these are the kinds of like the territory that we work with. And probably for architects or for us, it's very convenient in that sense. Maybe to respond to your question, we would probably need to live in Canada, or like we would end up having other solutions. But it's part of the conditions that we have to take advantage of also.
This is very seductive. I'd love to be able to apply that.
Yeah, well, that's why people are moving. Architects' firms are moving to Mexico, or Latin America in that sense.
But I,
Yes, Gallia. Well, also.
It's not just that because you don't have to deal with a climate barrier, you come up with great ideas. Here there's excessive resources, and sometimes those excessive resources generate ties, and we cannot do simple things because we all buy into this complexity. Of course, the climate has a role to play, but we could do something simpler here, and with more bravado. Because one, just to change the topic, but one of the things that I admire about your work is how you work with grids. That traditionally grids are considered, if in the context of art, let's say Sol LeWitt is considered a formalist, more rigid artist. And they are now less formalist, more avant-garde, more kind of concept-driven artists. In architecture, sometimes there is that tendency to think of somebody that works with grids as somebody that it's a kind of modernist and not in tune with the kind of last-minute, more current thinking process. Of course, I do not think that way, but I do not know how to articulate how do you see the grid? How do you see the use of a more strict geometry? But at the same time, as an avant-garde contemporary thinker in architecture.
just first to finish the question that was here, and then I think that here you have so many regulations that I have a friend that's a Mexican architect, and he's living in the United States, and he told me, you know with whom do I work now? I work with a lawyer, not with an architect. Because there's so many regulations that really like limitate how you design, I think. And in Mexico, like we are very glad that we don't have those regulations, and we can do so many things in that sense. Even with extreme weather, even if you're in the northern part and you have to we have a lot of ways to deal with all these regulations and all these things that I think that makes the architecture more creative, but also more, how do you say the word, more fresh, more simple sometimes, I think. And for the grid, I think that, yes, I don't like the formalist architecture. I think that you also, like going back to basics, like I believe that you just use these simple ideas, and as I said, you transform it or you resignify them in a very simple way that it can be contemporary, it can be unique, but it doesn't have to be a formal idea or a very, like showy idea. Instead, it's the opposite, but I think that it's more powerful in my point of view.
I mean, I think just to, in the end, it's not, the problem is not the problem of whether it's in a cold or hot. The problem is that you're reworking the question of boundary in a kind of very basic way and not relying on technology in the sense of, not, to your resource, it's not because we can that we should, right? It's not, I think if you look at architecture, as a kind of negation, just by the mere fact of re-examining the boundary from an architectural perspective, becomes a kind of project, right?
Yes, for example, the highway service units, like they're very sustainable with very simple things. And we don't have the technology to become, well, some buildings are in Mexico, but I don't, I'm not into the LEED or all those sustainable ideas. I'm more like into like very simple things, very logical things to follow, like cross ventilation, like putting the right vegetation so you don't have to have a lot of water to make them grow. And so with all these simple ideas, when you put them together, then they become more sustainable and more powerful again.
Right, I mean, it's what has been given over to engineering, you're reclaiming as part of architecture, I think, which is very difficult to do here. One last question. Juan?
Yeah. I want to
take it somewhere else.
Changing the direction of this question of the context, environment, weather, conditions. So, because finally, the question is what architecture has to defend us of, no? So if you are in Sweden, your enemy is the cold, so you need fences for that. And you can do a lot of efforts, architectural design efforts, to make this transition between the inside and the outside because the cold. But perhaps in Mexico, the outside enemy is the violence, no? Or, or the social context, or the many other problems that are exactly as important as problematic as the weather condition in other places. So apparently you have a nice weather, which I'm not sure it is, because humidity or many other factors are also very complicated. But what I think in your case, you said is quite simple, and I think it's super sophisticated. The way you eliminate these boundaries against that are there, existing, and are incredibly established, to mark differences that are not exactly the weather conditions, but are other, no? And my reflection is in cities like Mexico. I think it's really interesting how the impact of small amounts of architecture. So it's not a question of scale or size. It's perhaps a question of how much architecture you need to mobilize to create a big impact. And in your case, it's really amazing because some of your projects really take a vast surface, in this, like the channel or many others. Perhaps what you do is a little, but the impact is big, And if we think buildings built in Mexico City in the last years with a real impact in terms of changing the center of gravity of the city, whatever, I don't know, you build or others build skyscrapers every day and very big pieces of architecture. I don't know, perhaps the library by Alberto Calach or something like that were super important 10 years ago. And what, but today, perhaps some projects like those are the ones who are infiltrating the change of the city. And we were with Galia today talking about Medellin and many other places, and Bombay, where these kind of projects are being very, very important in terms of the capability of transformation of the city and the urban culture. And I think it's something that could be exported. So the question about do you see yourself working in other places? Yes, because there are many places with that kind of problems that you have the experience.
And I think as an architect, you have the responsibility. It's not an option. You have to do it. You have to do these social projects because in Mexico City it's very visible, like these poor and rich and these social issues that there's no way you're not doing it. So the office works with private projects to sustain the public projects that we do, many for free, many for, but we have to do them. And we really believe that this has a big social change, so a big social impact in changing the reality of those people. So I think that as an architect, it's a responsibility to do it.
Thomas, you had one?
No, I was just excited about this idea. I got excited about this idea of re-signification, and not to travel us back to 1995 and talk about signs and signifiers, but your use of language, even in your presentation, contexto, was very exciting, and I think part of the energy of your practice. And I just wonder if there's a connection between the way that you stage your conversations, the mindfulness about the way you speak, and the resignification of objects to make the ordinary extraordinary, to make us see new meanings in things that we think we know, but we see them in a new way. So resignification, I just wonder if you could tell us more about it.
Yes, sure. I think that, I have been working with all these ideas. I put them in a text also because, it's better to speak in English and in Spanish. And no, just to gain all these ideas and to transmit them more clearly. That we have in the office, we work all the time with with research and with all these ideas of trespassing boundaries with architecture and working with literature, cinema, biologists, with many different disciplines that I think that nourish our architecture. So I think it's very important to work with different disciplines and to reflect about what you're building, not only just do it, but then think of those ideas about the ecotone, about the cross-programming, about what habitability means, and not only designing, but also thinking about those ideas and trying to put them together to show the projects.
Just because it's exciting, to that example of taking a material that's always used one way and simply turning it and using it the other way. Or taking that same simple steel that's very familiar and using it just slightly differently. and then changing the meaning every other time you see that material throughout the whole city. That resignification seems like such a great example of that kind of urban acupuncture, and how you take something simple, but it's not simplistic, and something ordinary, but it's basic in a way that is productive, to go back to basics.
And I think I call it an active look, an active way of seeing. Like when you're active and not passive, then you start seeing things in another way. And just about seeing these things in another way, then it's how you transform them, no? And then you resignify them to become extraordinary. Because I think everything is invented. We're not inventing many things, but we are resignifying them, and that's the way that we change things.
Great, Rozana. I couldn't have thought of a better way to start the semester. Thank you so much.
Thank you.